This month, Square Enix and Deck 9 returned with a fantastic new installment to the Life is Strange franchise. Now, this is the third major installment in the series, but technically the fifth overall, and it's called True Colors, which no, is not a tribute to the great Cyndi Lauper, but instead a fantastic return to this wonderful world with brand new friends and a familiar face. Now, I'm going to keep this as non-spoilery as possible. There may be ever so slight ones, but I'll try to warn you beforehand. So, quick synopsis of the game. You play as a young woman called Alex Chen, who's just cool, okay? She wears cool clothes, she's got a cool haircut, and she's actually recently left a group home because she's been in care since she was a young child, and she has gone on a journey in order to reunite with her older brother, Gabe. They were separated as children because of going into care, and he very sweetly tracked her down and has invited her to live with him in this small mountain town where he now lives called Haven Springs, Colorado. Unfortunately, this beautiful, perfect moment of reuniting is ruined when disaster strikes and Alex finds herself plunged into confusion, conspiracy, and potential threat. But Alex has something to help her along her journey. If you're familiar with the Life is Strange franchise, you'll know that there are characters, often the protagonists, who are gifted or perhaps cursed depending on how you look at it. And Alex is no different. So Alex's gift is, as the name of the game suggests, that she can see inside people, metaphorically, not physically, that would be gross, but she can see their strongest emotions when they're feeling them. Now, these often tend to be things like anger, sadness, confusion, and she can see it kind of almost like an aura of colour around them when she meets them. And as part of this, she can also hear their innermost thoughts. But this hasn't always served her well because she can also then take on those feelings and those thoughts and end up responding in the same way as that person. So, for example, if they're feeling significant anger, she too will start to get angry. And the game is kind of both about her using this gift to try and help people and also to further her investigations, but also to try and temper them with this beautiful place that she's gone to that's kind of acting as like a cathartic place for her to explore and become the person she wants to be. So as a brief synopsis, first off, I want to talk briefly of the franchise. I first played the original Life is Strange when I was a teenager, and I really connected with this game. My brother actually ended up buying me a Polaroid camera, in part because I just loved Max and her artistic flair using a Polaroid. And so I love the aesthetic of these games. So they're very indie, they're very interested in what you might call the mundane. So there's always, beauty in the world around you rather than necessarily in these like magical things that these people can do. And they always do unusual things. There's always quirky characters. It was one of the first times I experienced D&D as a idea or as a pastime was through these games. And I just love the aesthetic style that they create. And this game is no different, where Max was in love with her Polaroid camera, Alex is in love with records and vinyl and music. And the soundtrack, like every other addition to this franchise, is beautiful. They had Angus and Julia Stone do a lot of the soundtrack, but there's also Phoebe Bridgers, Nova Moore, and plenty of other people whose music you'll enjoy. Now, the game does not disappoint. This installment goes, I think, back much more to the first game, more than necessarily the second one. It's got that same community vibe, that same sort of teenagers or young adults being young adults, but also having to contend with the world that they live in. And I fell in love with Haven Springs. In fact, when I finished this game, I genuinely thought about running away to America and finding my own Haven Springs in Colorado. And the little community that they create in this game is really well thought out, and you really can get to know these characters if you take the time to do side quests and sort of just talk to them and things and learn a little bit more about them. And it just felt so nice to have a game where, whilst the protagonist is going through all these things, they're not going through them alone, because there was always someone on hand to help. Which means we should probably talk about two of these characters in particular. So your two close confidants in the game are Ryan and Steph. Now Ryan is this sweet-natured guy who's also fiercely loyal. He's very much into like his wildlife and things like that, but he's also harboring a deep guilt about the accident that led to Alex's current situation, and there's some really lovely moments where they talk about that. And it's a game that's very interested in dialogue. It's not necessarily interested in a lot of action. You know, there's no quick time events like you'd find in something like Until Dawn. It's very, very steady, slow, and about this story and about really going in depth about these characters. And then there's Steph, who everyone, including myself, were dying to see again after we fell in love with her in Life is Strange Before the Storm, which was the prequel to the original game. And Steph now runs a record store in Haven Springs, and she's just really cool, and she and Alex hit it off from the go, which is lovely. Now these two make up your romance options for the game, which is interesting. This is the first time I think where the franchise really went in for actually setting up romance as an integral part of the story rather than just being a little bit of a side thing. And what's also nice is that although they do have similar romance paths, you don't fall into that sort of man versus woman binary that I think you find in other games, or where it's the same romance but just the skin is different on the character you're romancing, which I've talked about in previous games, happens quite a lot because it's just easier. So it was nice to actually really flesh out these relationships and then have to make that choice of who you saw yourself with. If you want to, you don't have to, but I think you lose out on a lot of the game if you don't get to know them and fall in love with them. I fell in love with both of them. They're great. Now, going back to the sense of community in this game, it was incredibly warming. There's almost a whole chapter of the game dedicated to a live action roleplay. And you find yourself really getting into taking part and becoming one with this community. I just grinned the whole way through that chapter. It was just delightful. They really capture, on the other hand, this sense of turmoil that Alex feels about suddenly being part of this community. You know, she grew up in care, she has real issues with abandonment, but also not fitting in. And now she's getting into this new space and she's, you know, falling in love with it and falling in love with the space, just as you are yourself. And I think it's a really beautiful part of the game. Now, I did have a few issues with the game. I had glitches and a couple of bugs, which we've kind of come to expect from newly released games. One big one, particularly for me through my run through of True Colors, was like highlighting on things like hair would be missing or certain images would be slightly blurred. I also had to laugh at one moment where there was like a weird Cyberpunk 2077 T-pose glitch where, Alex just suddenly was T-posing before carrying on with the scene, which was a bit jarring. But all these things are slowly being rectified with patches, and Square Enix have a great customer service group who are monitoring people's submissions of bugs and tending to quickly fix them. I have mixed feelings about this, honestly. That's something that should have been picked up by the QAs you employ before launch, but I guess a few are always going to slip through the cracks. So it was a little bit jarring occasionally. It would kind of pull you out of being very in-depthly kind of in this game, and then suddenly this weird thing would happen and you'd kind of be thrown out of the immersion. But, you know, it's something I think, particularly with the current climate and things, we have to accept. And then they are very quickly rectified. This game was also a little bit on the short side, so it cost the same as a full price game that we expected. I got through it much quicker than I thought I would. So I think I played for around a week, where I'd play like a few evenings for a few hours kind of thing. It ended very quickly, and it follows the same pattern of having 5 chapters that the other games had. But what they've also removed is that you now can't buy single chapters. You may remember from previous games, you can actually choose just to play the first fifth of the game. And I think that was really important because it meant people could try the game without having to spend 50 quid on it first, and then could decide it was for them or it wasn't for them, and then make a decision based on that. But instead now you have to buy the whole thing. And like I say, it was maybe 20 hours maybe 25 pushing it if you were really going in depth to exploring everywhere. It wasn't very long. And given, I spent the same on Ghost of Tsushima, which can take over 100 hours, I would have expected perhaps a little bit more. But it is a game that I'm actually looking forward to replaying soon, which I don't normally do for most games. There's very choice games that I would replay so soon after finishing them, but Life is Strange True Colors is definitely one of them. So ultimately, this is a beautiful game with some very emotive moments that encourages us to see the beauty in the little things in life, and recognize that no matter what we think of a person, you never actually know what they're hiding underneath. So I've loved my time with Life is Strange True Colors. I will definitely be returning. And actually, once I finish making this video, I'm off to go and play the DLC, Wavelengths, for another boost of Steph content.